Hi everybody, welcome to History 319, U.S. History Through Film for fall of 2014. I just have a couple of things I want to go over on the syllabus with you and then we can get started. Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11 in the morning until 12 noon Pacific Standard Time are the 2 hours I have set aside for office hours. I am 9 hours ahead of you because I'm in Paris this term, so if those hours don't work for you, we can probably arrange something else, but we'll need to make individual arrangements. So let me know, please. We can find something that will suit both of our schedules. And we can meet via telephone, which isn't super easy for me, but can be done. We can do Google Hangout, IM chat, email, whatever works for you. That's best. You have two required texts. The first one is Trevor McCriskin and Andrew Pepper, American History and Contemporary Hollywood Film. And the second one is a book called America on Film, Representing Race, Class, Gender, and Sexuality of the Movies by Harry Benshoff and Sean Griffin. You need both of those books. And one is far more dense and challenging than the other, and that's the McCriskin and Pepper. It's a really difficult book. It's highly theoretical. I still have trouble reading it, and I've been reading it for years now. Don't let that intimidate you, and I'm not telling you that to intimidate you. What I am telling you is that it's not a book that you can read a few minutes before you get ready to do a paper, and it's not a book that is light reading in terms of intellectual work. It's pretty heavy lifting, and I invite you to work through it. It's also written in a particular academic style, which is very British, and so it's sometimes very difficult to follow and tease out the ideas. And we're going to be working with this text throughout the term, but the reason I tell you this immediately is because in this first reading that I have assigned for week 1, which is the introduction of McCriskin and Pepper, there's some really key terms there and key concepts that we're going to be working with throughout the term, and you're going to need to return to that introduction several times, or maybe continually throughout the term, to get a handle on what we're talking about and what ideas are sort of anchoring the way we approach these films. And they are in that introduction. First and foremost, is this idea of the benign meta-narrative, and that's something we're going to be working with explicitly this week in the discussion board. In addition to that, you have 2 films to watch each week, and then a short comparative and contrast analysis paper on the 2 movies, and that paper requires you to incorporate ideas from the readings into your analysis. And that means really engage with the ideas, and that may mean that you struggle with them. It's not about getting the idea, but really working through the ideas and coming to terms with them in your own way in the context of the films we're watching and of history in general. And it's important for you to remember that you have to use those texts and those ideas and concepts in the texts when you submit your paper. I tell students this every year, and every year there's a handful of students who write really smart, really interesting papers about the film, but they don't really incorporate the readings, and then they get Fs on their papers, and it's not a good way to start the term. So do realize that I say it in the syllabus, I'm pretty sure, and I say it in the assignment. Do realize that when I say that you need to use those terms, I actually mean that. You do have to use the concepts that you find in the reading. All right. The second thing is I'm really asking you to do a couple of things differently in this class. And one of the things I'm asking you to do differently is I'm asking you to view films differently. I mean, I was just at the movies last week, saw a movie that I really enjoyed, but I didn't really watch the film as an academic. I watched it as a consumer of entertainment in my leisure time. And I'm asking you in this class not to view films that way, to in fact view them as texts, to read the films both filmically in terms of how they produce their messages, how they do their work, their ideological work, and secondly, to read them as texts about history. what is it that they are saying about history, and why are they saying that? And related to that is, why is the message of the film that you're reading either agreeable or disagreeable to you? In other words, we are really engaging with these movies, with these films, as academic, intellectual pieces of work. And I would argue that, in fact, they are those things. And we'll talk more about that theme as the class continues. All right, that's just I'm going to say a lot more about that, probably more than you'll ever want to hear. But for now, I'll leave it at that. The second thing that I'm asking you to do is I'm asking you to jettison the approach of evaluating a historical film on whether or not it's accurate. And the introduction, we'll talk about this a little bit, and I'm going to talk about it more, as well as right now. But it's hard to let go of that. It's an easy way to critique films and an easy way to analyze historical films. Well, gosh, they used a catapult, and catapults weren't invented until, I don't know when catapults were invented, so maybe that's not a good example to use. But nonetheless, you can sort of sit back and say, well, that film was not historically accurate because blah, blah, blah. Accuracy is, I think, one of the least important and least interesting questions about a film. Films, movies, they're pieces of art. They're not going to be accurate in the sense that a text might be accurate. But that's not what we're asking them to do, whether we watch them for entertainment or whether we read them analytically as texts. What I'm asking you to do is set aside the easy question of whether a movie is accurate or not, and instead engage with a different, more complicated, and messier question, a question that cultural historians like to ask about all kinds of things: movies, television shows, cartoons, texts. And that is, what's the cultural meaning that this particular text makes? In other words, how does the film make meaning, and what meanings does it make? And then, of course, we will examine why we think that the film makes those sorts of meanings. This is a much more difficult and challenging question, but I think it's also a much more interesting question. It's not about accuracy, it's about how meaning gets constructed and why. And embedded in that is the question of political work or ideological work. And one of the main overarching themes of our class is that films do ideological work to produce a certain narrative about the United States and about the history of the United States. And when we watch films, whether we watch them in a class or, more importantly, when we watch them just as consumers of entertainment, when we watch films, we are actually being engaged in ideological work. And the more informed you can be about how and why messages of American nationalism and American history are articulated through film, the more savvy of a consumer you can be. And American history is particularly palatable, both to us as Americans and to other people in the world. So that's the sort of big overarching question that is going to drive the whole next 10 weeks as we sort of examine and unpack the way film, simple movies at the movie theater, how film really in fact does important, persuasive, powerful, ideological work. And in that sense, we're looking at the way films operate as teachers of history. It really as public historians, because far more people watch movies about American history than take college classes about American history. So that is, I hope, sort of a nutshell message about the conceptual undergirdings of what my agenda is as we all embark upon the next 10 weeks together watching lots of great films. I'm going to leave it at that. I'll probably come back with a little video or a little podcast of some sort to share some other ideas with you. But for right now, you need to get to work. You've got some reading to do, and you've got a couple of films to watch. And I will end actually with just a brief comment on those films. Okay, so we're watching Black Robe and Last of the Mohicans. Many of you may have seen Last of the Mohicans. I doubt that anyone has seen Black Robe. They're two very different films. They both deal with the questions of cultural contact and cultural exchange. And one of the main questions I want you to keep in mind as you watch them is this: how is cultural contact portrayed? And how are the dynamics of power portrayed? Who has it? Who doesn't have it? And what contests are there over it? And then you're going to start talking about that in the discussion board, not waiting for a prompt from me, but doing it on your own as engaged intellectuals reading films. Right? I will say that Last of the Mohicans is a classic example of a Hollywood blockbuster, and it contrasts sharply with Black Robe, which is an indie film out of Canada, I believe, and though they were made around the same time, they have very different political inclinations. Black Robe is sometimes misread by students. Black Robe is an effort. You can say whether or not it succeeds. That's entirely up to you, making a set of claims about and interpretations about the film. But it's designed to really look critically and sensitively at cultural contact without sort of privileging a heroic narrative over the more complicated ways that cultures contacted one another and interacted with one another when Europeans came to North America. So given that, that's all I'm going to say right now. Get started on the readings. Please read the introduction, at least, of McCriskin and Pepper before you start watching either of the films. And if you've watched either of the films before, it doesn't count. You have to watch it again. And I would also encourage you to take notes. I can do that more directly and persuasively when this is a seated class, but it's an online class, so I can't really be there to make you take notes. But I will say that it's much more useful, and you'll have more to say when it comes to discussion board and follow-up questions, and then, of course, your paper, if you go ahead and take notes while you're doing the viewing. Okay, I rambled on a little bit more than I intended, but there you go. There's a Q&A section set up on the Canvas shell if you have any questions. There may be a few bits and pieces that aren't up as of today, but they'll be up over the next couple of days. But the main stuff that we need for class is there, and it's the reading, the discussion board, and the viewing of the films that we need to get started at this point. All right, welcome. I'm looking forward to a great term.